big thanks to Sushil in Indonesia and Alpha in the Caribbean. So agritainment seems to be one of the big things we're missing. We need more agricultural entertainment. I love that, camps for kids and whatnot. So I think now's a great time to turn to the audience and see if we have some questions. The infamous John Kunrad of the Hunger Project tends to get in there quickly at IFPRI. So I will hand it over to John.
There's a mic coming. You can keep your mic. Thank you. So this is a policy seminar, and I'm curious if there are any examples of countries implementing the package of kind of innovations that would take to make, as Vimlendra said, agriculture more socially attractive. From your earlier comments, it's pretty clear it's not just one thing. And do we have any examples of those policies actually happening?
Thank you, John. We have a lady here to your right.
Morning, Julie Howard from Michigan State University. And thanks for this panel. Thanks for the focus on youth and agriculture, which I think is just immensely important. I direct a project for Michigan State called the Agri-Food Youth Opportunity Lab, funded by MasterCard Foundation and active in Nigeria and Tanzania. And the project responds to the findings of work that Michigan State did and released in 2016. And it's great to hear some of those themes that we found also resonating through the discussion today, like the opportunities are not just on farm, but throughout the value chain, the need for changes in thinking about how we train people, the incredible opportunity with IT. So as we're going about now, trying to say, well, how would you do this differently in two countries to create these opportunities, make opportunities accessible to youth throughout the value chain, to use IT. It's a big lift. You know, there's not a lot of best practice. And there's a big gap between, here's we as academics saying this is what we need to do, and, well, who's done that successfully? There's not a lot of evidence out there. We're trying to create that evidence base, but again, it's a little bit lonely. One of the key areas that we found, and I'd love to have some discussion here today, the disconnect between youth, training centers, and private sector, right? Because private sector is key to providing employment opportunities for these youth, or to working with youth to help them recover from, my chicken flock died, now what do? I can't get another loan. You need that sort of supportive ecosystem of mentors and private sector kind of developing comfort zone working with youth. Hard to get that through social media, right? I mean, here in the US, we see in other spheres, so local Farm Bureau chapters do that to help, and 4-H helps to raise up youth. What's the equivalent in Africa? What's that supported? What's the 4-H and Farm Bureau and Rotary Club equivalent? I think we're finding that's at the center of our challenge, to build those connections and build the connections between private sector and training groups, right? To inform better, well, here's the kind of training we'd like to see. And if we could get youth trained to this standard, we'd employ them in a heartbeat. Discussions are not yet going on yet. So anyway, thanks again for such a wonderful discussion, and look forward to more work in this area.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent study. And some of my presentation actually comes from the MSU MasterCard Foundation study, and that wheel was one of them as well, the systems wheel. So I'm thrilled that actually came up, the dork side of me, for the background information. We'll take a third question, and then we'll turn to the panel for remarks, if there is a third. This young lady here.
Hello, my name is Felicia Heffernan. I'm an intern at America Solidaria. One of our main goals with our organization is to send out volunteers to underdeveloped countries to help end poverty worldwide, and we're mainly focused in Latin America and United States. So my question is, what are some suggestions or ways that we can help when we send out our volunteers? How can they help the youth over there to help end the poverty? I know with social media, of course, we can reach out and talk to the youth also, but what are like other ways we can tell the volunteers or any way they can help when they're in these countries, and because we do send volunteers over there and they help rebuild and recover when like after natural disasters and everything. So if any other suggestions would be great. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So 3 great questions. The one being, do we have a country that's implementing the whole policy package? And if so, even if it's, well, actually implementing it. They might have a policy package, but are they implementing it? The private sector in this, and especially in many developing countries, the private sector is the majority of the employment options for people in formal employment. So what does that look like in these gaps of training? And then thirdly, suggestions for sending volunteers to the field to actually build up this interest level. I don't know who's interested to go first. James, did you want to?
Sure, if I go first, then I don't have to think of a success story, because I can't. I'll leave that to you. I guess picking up on our colleague from MSU's point, I mean, I think when we think about some of the big success stories in America and developed countries, it's all about creating incubators and enabling environments for startups and so on. And I think we don't think about policy, or at least agricultural policy, in that way. We tend to think about how can we move all smallholders forward? How can we create sort of better business opportunities for the masses? Creating incubators and supporting winners and so on, that kind of goes against the way we think about how we should be designing policy and so on. But it is more like how we think about industrial policy, that balancing between creating an enabling environment for small businesses versus sort of tailoring policies to support promising sort of startups and enterprises. And so maybe it's politically difficult. Even just picking green belts and breadbasket regions in a country is politically challenging. Picking particular enterprises maybe even more so, but maybe we do need to learn some lessons from industrial policy, which itself is learning lessons in a modern age, but learn some lessons from industrial policy about how we go about nurturing sort of promising small startups and so on. And then I think policy still, having said that, is a powerful lever. I think these big foreign companies coming in and are showing a lot of interest in Africa, in Tanzanian cassava, or Indian demand for sunflower seeds and other oil seeds and so on. I think these big companies that are coming in, we typically ask them to engage in lots of smallholders as a prerequisite. It's often a requirement for getting government backing. Why don't we also sort of really emphasize participation of youth and actually trying to elicit some of the ideas and expectations of youth, not necessarily through outgrower schemes, which try to involve as many smallholders as possible, but how can you partner with innovative local ideas and so on? And so I think policy can play that role, but we do have to rethink our entire strategy. Thank you.
So I think to give a little bit of an example on how truly this global mindset can be turned down to a local intuition, what I love to call it, I'll take the example of Didas again with the Kenyan mango farmer. So what happened is after he was able to put his empowerment program together for farmers, it kind of raised a question within this global storytelling community. Well, you're doing a lot for farmers, but you're not doing a lot for female smallholder farmers within your community. What is that you're going to be able to do to really engage female smallholder farmers in your operations? So what happened, he started to do, with some guidance of another farmer in Asia as well, a women empowerment program where he really was able to teach women ICT skills. What happened, and that goes down to a policy level where you have mentioned that maybe we're not able to communicate this message that well through social media, he was able to then bridge the program that he has started to a municipal level. It wasn't taken up by the government yet, and have it somewhat become part of the policy discussion and the policy shaping solution. Whereas otherwise it wouldn't have been a program that would have been part of the policy discussion or the policy development in that sense. Another thing which really helps, and where I think globalized communication and technology can really step in, is what I also encourage global storytellers to do, is have somewhat of a social media mentor and menteeship platform. We have social media where we're able to really share information, where we share stories, and we don't necessarily need to have a mentor that mentors us that maybe is in the same country as we are, right? We're able to build up virtual mentorship programs that truly are able to then help us to potentially put those ideas into actions and those actions into policy later as well. Another thing, how can BBP really be put in place? One thing that Mucho Mangos did, which I've really liked, was upon consultation of other people in this community. He has found a private organization that is close to what John Deere in the US is as well, that actually was able to provide him with certain farming skills, with tractors, like you've mentioned before as well, with somewhat of the Uber tractor strategy. So he was able to really scale up his operation and then potentially also thinking down the line in the future to really implement that into different municipalities as well. So I think there is, again, I just want to emphasize on that and piggyback a bit on what you have said as well, James, is that youth challenges in developing countries are not challenges created by youth, but they're just inadequate notion of understanding on how we can really use effective global development tools. And then another thing, what you have mentioned, and when you send your volunteers in the field, what can you do to really get them engaged with the communities? One thing I am thinking of doing right now with storytelling is to really build up chapters in different communities, right? So if you have a volunteer going in the field, I think the most effective thing is take a stakeholder analysis, what is happening in this community. And people are going to be able to tell you what is happening in this communities of people who aggregate a chapter around a certain cause. May it be agriculture, may it be peacekeeping, may it be women empowerment. And then once you have bridged those connections, your volunteers have bridged those connections, then I think it's much more easier to move forward and really tackle those people and those communities who really need support the most.
So I guess the
So-
pressure's on for you to think of the success story of.
No, so let me address John's question because I think that's been left unanswered. Look at it this way, that any profession will have an economic and a social aspect to it. And the social aspect of it can never be government diktat or a government policy. The day agriculture becomes remunerative and you have talented, educated young people taking to agriculture, the social status of agriculture is going to go up. Today, agriculture is being seen as the last refuge. So you have young people coming in, but those are the guys who have got nothing else perhaps or could not make it elsewhere who get back to the land. And therefore the status is down. What you really need to do is to bring education, to bring the correct form of agriculture education back in schools and colleges. I don't know, but you are out in the field always. Just go to any of the schools, say in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India or in many countries in Africa, who also have some farming linked to the school. One punishment which a child is given if he misbehaves in class, is not studying well, is to be sent out to farm. Now that's a punishment. So obviously in that child's eye, the status of agriculture is low, farming is low. When you get that as a reward, that you have done very well in class, so go out and do some farming for half an hour, that is when the status of agriculture is going to go up. So it has to be a very, it's not an easy solution which is going to come through in one day. It's only when you get good people going back to agriculture, again, as I said, not out of compulsion, but out of choice. Educated people who could leave agriculture but did not leave it and stuck to it is the time when you will find agriculture gaining a status back. I don't think it's really reached that stage anywhere around the world, but I hope it does. I have just one more point to make, and that is about the private sector playing a role. I think it's extremely important that the private sector come in this field because there is a huge gap which the government is not being able to fulfill around the world, and it has to be a partnership. My take on this is that around the developing world there is still a fear of the private sector, which needs to go fast, and that will go fastest if the governments start looking at strong partnerships, collaborations with the private sector to really bring them in a big way. In many countries, they have come in the extension activities, but they have not come in so much in training activities yet. So I think there is, it is a big lift, as you rightly said, but I think there is a real need for national governments to really go out and partner with the private sector to ensure that, because without them, this remuneration and return is never going to come into farming. So you have to really take them along. And that gap still exists. We have been, as an international organization, we have been working with over 120, 130 national governments, and in every place FAO does try and instill this with the government policymakers to ensure that their policy prescriptions which come out have a role for private sector in it.
Sorry, if I can jump in on that. I mean, I wanted to, I'm shocked by your numbers about just how old current farmers are, and the real inertia that gets locked into the system with this land tenure. And so I think I would add to that you know, we need to change this. One way of changing the idea that agriculture is for old people is to deal with this land tenure issue. And I think part of it comes from, like you said, it's a retirement package. Right, we need to solve the social protection problem, and so I think there's another way to frame this youth challenge, and one is to say we have 60% more food that we need to produce, and can young people produce it? The other is to say, to some extent, even in Africa, you know, that youth bulge is past. We need to now start looking to what Africa's baby boom generation is going to, what their retirement is going to look like, and that's happening in 2070. So we've got half a century to get Africa ready for retirement, right? And that's a really daunting challenge. And I think if you frame it like that, suddenly this becomes just like China's thinking about long-term development. We start to get all ages concerned about the policy challenge, not necessarily about how to keep youth happy, but how to keep countries sustainable. Yeah.
I totally agree, but there's no two ways. You have to reframe this whole question. You have to perhaps work both ways, how to ensure that the people who have reached their retirement age in agriculture actually go out and are looked after well after that, but they also have to have a push from down below for the young to take to agriculture. You can't have a void there. The moment you have a gap there, it becomes an issue. Somebody has to farm. Somebody must, like a driverless car is coming, but a farmerless agriculture is, way off. So it may come. Who knows? It may come, but we still need farmers.
Excellent. I think we have more questions now cropping up. And this lady on the far right, we'll take Brian as well after that, and then a third.
Yeah, I think we are two perspectives. I challenge FAO's number 60 years average for Africa. So in Ghana, we were told the same number, but we look at household survey data for multiple rounds. The farm age is 48. Then age barely changed over a couple few rounds of survey. That's the first thing. We always use this kind of number scale people, but bottom line is Africa average age is not 60. Right, so that's why we have to be careful when we use this kind of number to tell story. Second thing is, like you said, I agree, there's no scale up level of youth successful story. You can find tons of youth entrepreneurs in agriculture. In Ghana, the country are much more familiar. So the youth simply told us why they went back to agriculture. It's not because there's a large choice, right? So, and then very recently in November, we went to Addis for mechanization workshop. We had field trip. We made a group of tractor provider. None of them are farmers indeed, but all of them working for agriculture, all youth. The guy talked to me in English much better than me. I asked him, what kind of education level? I have an MBA degree. I said, did you grow up from farm household? No, I'm from Addis. They saw opportunity in agriculture. So that's what I said. All of this successful story, we need to ask ourselves your question. What's the policy they need? How many all of the people actually collect them? We cannot just always talk about the top-down kind of method, training them. We have to look, actually we have to know why without any training they can do things which surprise us. Talking about big success story, actually China. So we are talking about average farmer age in China, aging, that's for sure. But now China livestock sector, 70% actually produced by large farm. Crop sector, 50% produced by commercial, relative large farm. Among them, they are much younger. So that's a story. It's not because they inherit the land from farmers. They have to go back because it's much more flexible land rental market. Start from informal farmers simply just among themselves, no policy intervention, but now government start to encourage, to have a real kind of policy to encourage, to build this land user transaction center, plus, like you say, credit support. As soon as everything start to be formalized, bank jump in. Without this formalizing, banks, indeed, bank cannot give, private sector cannot give the loan to any of them. So that's basically things we need to work with. We talk about in the fantasy way, like to make agriculture attractive. But even when you talk to farmers, none of them tell you farming is terrible life. They enjoy their farming. They're proud of them as a farmer. That's what I made farmer. None of them tell me that's my last option. Otherwise, I'm going to. They tell you their difficulty. They want the government. They want you guys help us solve the difficulty. None of them they say this is my last option. I must subsist agriculture. None of them even want to call themselves subsist agriculture.
I'm sorry, if I could have you just get to your question as well, so we can let other people ask.
It's not my question. I feel our attitude should be changed. Among our researchers, we are more like saving them. Sure. We have learned from them to say what they need.
No, these are definitely valuable contributions in thinking about fascinating ideas like flexible land rental markets and these more large-scale farming corporate movements that have more youth involved in them. And you're right, we do need to think about the other side of agriculture too, where there are examples of people that do find a certain return on investment of it being very fulfilling, and where can we also replicate that? Not always just the markets, but where can we replicate the enjoyment of it too, and thinking about the attractiveness. So thank you for that. And I always like a reference to Ghana. I worked there for many years. So Brian, I think you had a question as well.
I did, thank you. And thanks to the presenters for raising a lot of really compelling and unfortunately right now pretty intractable questions for us. My question really has to do with how we grapple with the structural constraints imposed by low food prices. And right now, I mean, food prices go up and down, but right now, for small producers especially with increasing fragmentation in land, getting into agriculture looks kind of like a poverty trap. And thanks to Julie and her Michigan State colleagues for helping us understand how this is perpetuated. So my question really is, if we did a thought experiment and we quadrupled or quintupled food prices at the local level, the incentive signals would shift very quickly. We'd have a lot more young people headed into agriculture just because of the obvious economic signals. We definitely do need cultural support for that, to change values so that this is regarded as a worthy thing to do. But in encouraging people to move from subsistence to commercial production and enter the market, we essentially put them into a competitive environment where they're trying to produce at lower prices than current food prices. And until they adopt the traditional strategy, which is moving to scale, they are going to remain at a disadvantage. How do we handle the market issues around food? And we have 800 million people now, roughly, give or take, in a fairly low food price environment. We want to shift signals. How do you do that without consolidating, going to scale, adopting labor displacing technologies which have typified Western high external input production, rather than labor absorbing technologies? And I guess that gets at, we really need to rethink some of the models about how one grows an economic enterprise to produce more than just more food, to produce stable livelihoods, to reduce debt, to increase gender equity, and to solve some of the social protection issues by keeping families together in rural areas so that you have sort of a collective effort to keep farm enterprises going. So I just wanted to raise that as sort of how do we grapple with market realities here?
I had a feeling your question wouldn't be a simple one. And that's great. And then we had one second question. One over here, and then we'll come to this one. So we have 3 questions to go to the panel. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much. My name is Astrid Jacobs from the German Embassy. I'm really thrilled by this discussion. It's really looking to it from various angles. I think what is the most striking or the most, let's say, takeaway for me is that we have to start to change, to think about the policies. And we had a lot of actors used, the governments, private sectors, research, the farmers themselves, but a strong driver are also NGOs all over the world. I'm talking about the religious or whatever kind of NGOs in Germany who are doing projects and so on. And how can we engage them? Or is there a role for them? And how can we change their thinking as well? Thank you.
Excellent. And we had another one here.
My name is Suresh Babu from IFPRI. A fundamental question for James. James, what will happen if you shift the age from 24 as the cutoff to 35? Because in most of the debates or dialogues that I have with youth, I hardly see anyone less than 25. They're all between mostly 25 to 35. Because that's when they really come into the policy dialogue or even take the attitude of an entrepreneur. By that time, they finish their education and they're ready to really get into the... I wonder what your numbers will look like from that perspective, right? So I want to call them young adults rather than youth. So that may change the whole scenario in terms of how we think about what we want to do for young adults, right? That's one thing. Second is this, you don't want all the youth to stay in agriculture. We don't talk about that. I mean, in fact, in most of the country contexts that I am working with, we want youth to get out. And they are still struggling within the system, even with the education, because there are too many educated youth hanging around in rural areas without not really working in agriculture. Then you talk about the land issue, right? And the farmer now lives longer, even in the Indian context. He's 8 years old when he gives the land to his 60-year-old son. And you have another generation waiting for that land. So you don't want to, land issues are important, but how do we work around that so land consolidation requires youth to get out actually more. If you have 3 children, 2 should be out of agriculture so that at least some element of land consolidation can happen, even in Africa where land is constrained. So I think we should be thinking along those lines. The third point is from the land consolidation perspective. In fact, in some of the rural communities in Africa I deal with is they want youth to get out so that they can bring some money for the older people to farm better with this money that they can get in terms of new technologies, fertilizer and hybrid seeds and so on. So it's not all that bad that youth can actually get out and if they can support agriculture. And they are the farmers outside farming who are helping the farming in order to produce this food that we need. So we should not forget that. I mean, what is that? So in essence, I'm talking about a youth transition. Where is this real transition? Where is this threshold when we say youth should stop going out of, and we have not found the transition in a dynamic kind of structural kind of system. And finally, the importance of the private sector coming in. We have not really worked with the private sector. We talked about it, but there are very few examples of vocational training by the private sector. If the private sector is ready to hire somebody, right? Why can't they invest in the rural youth to prepare them to hire? So the capacity strengthening aspect of it. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I think in the interest of time, I'd like to turn to the panel, and we're certainly welcome to have some closing conversation amongst ourselves afterwards, but these have been some wonderful remarks and questions for us to continue to explore. So I don't know who'd like to go first, but just as a quick recap, thinking about land consolidation, this youth transition, is it really contingent on the age bracket we place them from in this more adolescent years from 15 to 24? and also where the private sector fits in this and where NGOs fit in this as well, and how we're shifting their role with stakeholders. And at all, with any remarks as well on any other ways that we're looking at the big farms and youth roles in large farm enterprises as well. So I don't know who'd like to start with those, but Vimlendra, sure.
Let me just address a couple of questions. Where do the figures come from? 58.3 America, USDA. And I think the difference in perception is because these figures are being taken for primary farmers. So you may have others working on the farm, but it's the primary farmer age which is being calculated at 58.3. So these are all figures which have been provided by national governments. Japan 67, Japanese agriculture. It's not figures being cooked up anywhere. These are figures provided by national governments. So if the USDA says 58.3 and we take it at that. I totally agree with you. There are numerous success stories. There are innumerable success stories, and those are the success stories which need the best practices which need to be replicated. My only concern is that for every one of these success stories, there are areas of huge concerns still left in many countries. And those need to be addressed through policy prescriptions, through national governments and their policies. Coming to what we heard about the need for the youth to go out, the transition to happen, absolutely, there's nobody who challenges that proposition at all. That's not the proposition either being discussed or being challenged. If you see the SOFA report of FAO this year, 2017, the whole idea is behind developing rural areas in a continuum to link the smallholder farmer with the urban consumer and getting jobs for the rural youth in this continuum. One big difference if you see between, say, US farming and you said Indian farming would be that in US, if there are 100 people linked to agriculture, 20 would be on the farm and 80 would be in the value chain up. In India, if you go back to India, then you'll have 80 people on the farm and 20 in the value chain. So I totally agree with you that there is a need to transition people out of agriculture into other activities. But that does not negate the basic premise that you need people to come back to agriculture. Educated youth to get attracted to agriculture. That does not negate the premise. It's not mutually exclusive. You need the optimum number. One is not asking for a number to overload the sector, which will obviously lead to diminishing returns. You need an optimum number working in the agriculture sector also. And with you, sir, I totally agree. It has to be a business model, which I think I mentioned that it has to be a very good balance between romance of enjoying agriculture to actual business model where the returns are high enough for you to take that as your profession. And that, whether just tripling or quadrupling the prices at local level, will those prices turn into economic profits? I don't know. That's not that simple in economics. But yes, the correct signals through policy prescriptions have to go to the youth to bring them back to agriculture.
James or Claudia?
So I think one thing I just want to touch on, and you've mentioned that very correctly, is how can you get farmers and youth farmers attracted to markets, and how do those markets fairly treat youth farmers in return, in the way they take their crops, in the way they are able to trade their goods and so forth. And I think one trend that we have seen with globalized technology in particular, and also social media groups such as Facebook or any other kind of trading apps such as Venmo, that there are possibilities also for youth in developing nations to trade their goods to other markets they otherwise would have not have had access to. So I think it's also about seeing how that can be potentially scaled up and how youth is going to be able to use those platforms in an accurate way and not in an abusive way, to see that agricultural best practices are not only being shared, but we're also going to be able to trade the goods as they are presentable to that. With regards to Astrid, that has mentioned, how can NGOs get more engaged? One kind of initiative I really like, and that comes up a lot in social media platforms as well, is organizations such as Global Citizens, for example, that really help youth or help underdeveloped youth to give them the possibility to connect them to NGOs, and then through their actions and call-out actions, connect the NGOs and this youth, then to policymakers, to politicians, and to people who are actually much more actively involved in the policy shaping process, and then turn those ideas that youth have into action. So I think, again, I just want to emphasize on the fact that there are different buffers of storytelling and different ways on how storytelling can be used and how stories can be shared, so we can actively get the message across, and then also bring farmers access to markets that otherwise would not have found access to.
Well, let me start with Suresh's question. I hope they weren't all for me. You had plenty of them. But let me just deal with the first one, which is, of course, if we move to the 25 to 34 bracket, which includes the African definition, everything becomes somewhat 10 years later. And so, of course, the youth bulge is peaking right now in places like Africa. Education levels are perhaps not quite as high as they are for the even younger generation, but I think the conclusions still stand that generation still is better educated, more familiar with technologies than the previous one. And I completely agree with you that we shouldn't be trying to force people to stay in farming. I don't even know how you would do that personally. But anyway, I think Brian's point, I couldn't have described it better myself. I think this world of low prices is incredibly difficult to make this farming a rewarding occupation. And you're right. I mean, the one example, you either go trade protection route, which I don't want to say, but maybe that is a one policy that needs to be thought through. The other is going to scale. And this comes back to Shinshen's question about large farms and where youth are engaged more in the large farms. And I'm South African, which means my home country's agricultural system is all about large farms. A small number of large farmers and hundreds of thousands of smallholders producing only 5% of the food in the country. That is perhaps a model we want to be cautious of. We definitely don't want to head down that direction. We want to find high-tech solutions that are also labor-intensive, and maybe this is the challenge to today's youth, is to find that combination that works well, and maybe the labor-saving technologies that we're seeing from Amazons and Googles and others are not the technologies that we want to be, or even maybe, are not necessarily the technologies or the kinds of technologies we want to be promoting in Africa. So, to come back to your question, where should we be looking? And I think one thing we are seeing as incomes rise in Africa, we're seeing diets change. And I think there is a movement away from the low-value cereals towards the higher-value products. And the question is, can we position countries in Africa to be able to compete with imports as the whole world moves in this direction? And so it's true prices are particularly low for cereals, and maybe we do need to start moving beyond that. But luckily for us, Africa is moving beyond that. And so we still have an opportunity on that frontier to find opportunities for youth. I don't know what they are, though, sorry.
Vimlendra.
Just to flag one point that, yes, large farms, technology is perhaps the right way to go, but we have to keep in mind that nearly 70 to 80% are smallholder farmers, and we have to work with them. So getting them to become large farmers is not that easy a prescription. So we have to ensure that the technologies we are looking at also helps us work with the smallholder farmers who are outnumbering the large farms in a big way, though the production values might be low. So a balance, again, I would say it can't be this or that policy. It has to be a balanced policy which the national governments have to come out with to cater to both the sides of the story.
And of course, sorry, just to carry on, I mean, one good example is the advantage of being a large farm is you can afford expensive capital equipment like tractors and so on. And yet we're seeing with things like Uber tractors, wherever they may be, that that technology can try and overcome some of those obstacles. So we do have to rethink or think creatively, as you said, what the opportunities look like in today as opposed to thinking 30 years ago.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, I want to just do the closing remarks a little bit differently than usual. I'd like to wrap up mine, but then I'd like to ask each of you to give the audience, both on the live stream and those in the room, a one-sentence tweetable closing remark that you would like for everyone to leave this room with. Tweetable. Now, you're lucky that Twitter increased their Twitter capacity, doubled it up to 280 characters. So you have like about a sentence and a half. But to leave, again, I'll just do the closing remarks to give you guys a moment to think about what your message will be for everyone and moving forward. But For the takeaways that I've gathered from today, one of the ones that stands out to me and has come up several times is, at what age are we influencing people in the positive realm around agriculture? And we need to start them very young and in many different areas. School is a great example. Children having agricultural entertainment in camps. You brought up volunteer interventions through America Solidaria. Start young with how we're influencing people in agriculture being a positive field. Strategic linkages, not just between sectors and how they work in a resilient food system, but strategic linkages with the reality of the majority of farmers being smallholder farmers and the greater output of larger farms, and thinking about how those strategic things can be moved forward. An Uber tractor model and land rental models are two great ways I think that that's been bridged a bit. Policy and credit and insurance opportunities, these lack significantly, and this isn't exclusive to the developing context. Insurance and positive credit opportunities for youth is pretty global, and thinking about that in the context of the social protection moving forward. We don't see so much of a social protection advantage or incentive for youth to go into agriculture. And doing away with fear of the private sector in building up these partnerships. Partnerships is going to be a crucial way forward, but everything also costs a significant amount of money, especially mainstreaming the technology behind improving farming and agriculture. So the private sector piece of this. And then finally, linking at the transitioning of the value chain numbers. So not needing necessarily to negate a need for a return in the agriculture, but the optimum numbers. And I think that's something very, very important. And youth are required for this. This isn't something where it's like, oh, it would be so cool if we saw. No, youth are 100% required. This is urgent. But, you know, cool and collected is the way we have to go forward. I liked when you were saying, let's not panic. Let's actually go forward reasonably and strategically, though it is urgent and has got to happen. So I hope that has left you with some things to marinate your tweet remarks. Who shall I start with? I'm gonna have to cut you off just like Twitter does, so. Start with the social media guru.
Tweeter, I guess, right? So my tweetable remark would be is that youth has the possibility to upper the threshold of extreme poverty of $1.90 through sharing thoughtful, authentic, and engaged stories that will empower others.
Excellent, thoughtful. I love that.
So I guess I don't tweet, sorry, so I'm going to be terrible. But I think I think the big message is food systems are already creating opportunities for youth. The problem is that policies aren't able to, today, aren't keeping up with fast-moving technologies and even fast-moving youth. And so we need to rethink the way we do business. We need a revolution in our research and a revolution in the way we sort of break down the silos between policy makers.
You're right, you're not the best tweeter, but you're getting there. No, I'm just kidding. That's wonderful. No, seriously, thinking about how we're gonna keep policy moving as fast as technology is advancing. I think that's one great takeaway from that, among a couple of other great things. And Vimlendra?
But let me try. In my mind, I think the narrative of agriculture in peril is overlapping with the narrative of youth in peril. And it's time that the policy changes come about to ensure that a good marriage is arranged between agriculture and youth. And not only arranged marriage, but I hope it turns into a love marriage, where the youth actually take to agriculture out of love.
I love that. The marriage between youth and agriculture should not be an arranged marriage. I quite love that. I think that's the perfect closing remark. Okay, preferably love. Should be arranged. Wonderful. Well, thank you, James, Claudia, Vimlendra, Rajul, IFPRI, and all of you for attending today and those online. Keep looking out for the publication of the video and any forward movement and write-ups after this, because as Claudia mentioned, we're coming up to the UN's Youth Forum. We have the Commission on the Status of Women, and I'll be heading out to the field in February to pick the brains of IFPRI staff there as we keep designing our youth programs too. So many things for youth to come in 2018. Thank you all and stay warm.